Welcome to Bipolar She. I'm your host, Janine Noel. Bipolar She is a storytelling podcast about living with mental illness. The content of the show may include stories of suicidal ideation and suicide. At the show's website, bipolarshe.com, I've listed ways to find support. If you ever need immediate help, please dial 988, a suicide and crisis lifeline. I believe in the healing power of writing and speaking about our darkest of days in raw detail. So let's go. Today, I sit down with Dr. Regina Lazarovich of Compass CBT. After suffering for an entire decade in her 20s, primarily with binge eating, she offers great insight into how our mental health is challenged by diet culture, thin privilege, fat phobia, and correlating health with body size. She is particularly interested in the binge restrict cycle. We talk about eating and body image at different life stages, how to recognize those who are suffering and how to encourage them to get help, and also how we can ask for help too. Well, welcome, Regina. So I thought we might just want to jump right into it. I usually ask a guest to go back in time and think about a crisis point. So I was curious if you would like to share one.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. I am happy to be here. I don't know if it's so much a crisis point as a crisis decade, I guess, but I'd be happy to take you through my story. And so my story starts, I guess, in college, in undergrad. So this was the early 2000s. I considered this to be the starting point of the development of my eating disorder. And so what happened was that I was working in a medical office while I was an undergrad, so maybe a freshman, I guess I must have been 18, 19. And in this medical office, I have to mention all the assistants and all the people that were kind of working there were really dieting. I think that was a really popular thing to do back then as it is now. And one day, one of the women who worked there came up to me and said, "Oh, your cheeks look a little plumper, like, maybe just kind of that kind of comment, right? Just commenting on my appearance." And if somebody made that comment to me now, I would respond very differently to how I did back then. But I think I was, young and vulnerable and probably had some social anxiety as well. And I took that comment to heart. And I think it clicked in for me that people who are like in larger bodies experience discrimination, right? Because, that was sort of a form of, just like an unsolicited criticism. And it felt like criticism. It didn't feel like a compliment. And again, in the context of everyone's dieting and the early 2000s. And so the way that I responded to that was I developed a fear, I would guess. I think that if I do nothing, then I will gain weight. And, just for context, I have unearned thin privilege. I live in a smaller body. I always have thus far. And that's not of my own doing. It's just my genetics. And it's probably what protected me from developing an eating disorder earlier in life. It's why, in high school I had no eating issues because nobody was commenting on my food because I had that thin privilege. So even though I was still in a smaller body, I decided to diet, not so much even to lose weight, but to kind of prevent myself from losing control and gaining weight, which would mean that I would get this negative feedback socially. And I say this, eating disorders are biopsychosocial. And so because of my maybe biology, because of my personality, when I decide to do something, I really commit. So I really, really committed to dieting. I was, very strict about it. I was very disciplined. And again, these are qualities that serve me in other areas of life where, hard work pays off. In this case, yeah, I was dieting for a couple of months and I probably lost weight. And again, I was a very good dieter. And one day, and maybe this could be one of many crisis points, I remember this. So I was living with my parents at the time, and we had this snack drawer, this cupboard that contains snacks in our house, in my kitchen for years, for the whole time that I was living there. And this day, I open it up and it was almost like a trance. It really felt like a trance where I just started eating food like indiscriminately. It felt really out of control. There was like almost a dissociative aspect to it, right? And I just like it's almost like my brain shut off and my body just started eating. Then I sort of came to and I realized what I had done, and I was mortified. I felt so much shame. I felt so much guilt. I felt I really messed up. And so the way I dealt with that is I doubled down on the restriction. And I was like, well, I need to be more disciplined. And so I continued to try to restrict, and then I would binge. And so that was kind of how it went for my 20s. And I really tried to get help. So I think this probably shaped my trajectory professionally. Like I ended up majoring in psychology in undergrad and minoring in health and nutrition and writing research papers on binge eating disorder and really, really trying to get help. That being said, I also think I got some, there were some barriers that I encountered, like being an immigrant, not really knowing where the resources are, just sort of met certain hurdles. And I just, in spite of my best efforts, like I couldn't get out of it. And I even went to different therapists and I did an intensive outpatient program. And really nothing really got me there. And so on the surface, I was very competent. I was able to go on to a PhD program in clinical psychology. But at the same time, I was really, really struggling and falling apart. And that dichotomy, for me, I think that the hardest part was the shame. Every time that I would binge, there was that like, why can't I just get that control? It works everywhere else, right? I was able to get straight A's in undergrad. Like, why can't I do this? And then in my early 30s, I finally was able to stop binge eating. And I really legitimately thought that I was cured of my eating disorder because I managed to white knuckle and willpower myself into stopping the binge eating. And I can tell you exactly how long that lasted because I was literally counting the days. It was 14 months. And again, I did it through sheer just white knuckling. And I really thought I was fine, except that, once in a while I would have a salad and they would accidentally put dressing on it and I would have a nervous breakdown. So I still had fear foods and I was really, the dieting piece didn't let up, like I was still restricting. But psychologically, I think I felt like I was in control. And then I went to this meditation, mindfulness training or presentation. And there was this woman that I met there who was a registered dietitian. And so, we talked and I was curious about what she does. And she told me she's an intuitive eating dietitian. And I had heard about intuitive eating, but I hadn't really kind of understood it. So this is just kind of my personality. I got curious. I bought the book. The book stayed on my shelf for a year, unopened. Then I had to have surgery on my hip because I fell, probably related to malnourishment, to be honest. And so I had to have the surgery. And during the time of the surgery, the recovery process, I had to be on crutches. I was homebound. I couldn't engage in movement, right? And so I opened up the book. And that book, I mean, it was sort of like what I needed. It honestly kind of changed my life. I think it's when my recovery started in earnest, because I opened this book and there was this quiz. I remember, like, are you an intuitive eater? Right. And I took this quiz and it just clicked right away. I think I was so ready, where I realized, oh no, I don't have a healthy relationship with food. I've actually just had anorexia for the past 14 months. And as I mentioned, it was white knuckling. I was not happy, right? It took so much out of me. My life was, really small. And as soon as I kind of recognized that, there were some other aspects just that I learned, where that book was my first introduction. One of them was this connection between restriction and binge eating, where, and it's of course more complex and there are some individual differences. But for me specifically, my relationship with food was totally normal. Like, I didn't think about it until I started dieting. And everything I had encountered until then was telling me, oh, the binge eating is the problem. And, like, apply all these tools and do these other coping strategies instead of the binge eating. It's all about the binge eating. And actually, it's the restriction that's the problem, right? If just physiologically, as human beings, if we restrict ourselves, the body will fight back in order to try to restore homeostasis, right? And so the binging, and the reason that it was so kind of violent, and just, I think that term applies, right? Where these violent swings between restriction and binge eating, because the harder you go in that direction, the harder you're going to swing back. And the binge eating, I realized, is actually my body's way of trying to survive the self-imposed famine. And so that was crucial for me to understand. And the other important piece of information that I think stood out, and I went on to kind of learn more and seek out therapy that was aligned with this, is that the reason why the dieting was so appealing to me is because we live in diet culture, where we are taught that being in a smaller body, that people in smaller body are better than people in larger bodies in all these different ways, right? We have all these different stereotypes. And in addition to that, I think there is also actual real structural bias against people in larger bodies, right? Like, you could see that in how difficult it is to just fly in an airplane, or, get an appropriately sized seat at a restaurant, or, just the world is not really accommodating medical settings, right? Like, and so I think I knew that because I live in this society. And again, I've always had thin privilege, and yet I was afraid to lose it. And it occurred to me that if we lived in a world where body hierarchy was not a thing, where if everyone was treated with dignity, regardless of all the other things, race, gender, but in this context, size, then I think a lot fewer people would be developing eating disorders. And just in general, I think it would be a better world. And it really aligned with my values. And learning more about weight stigma and the racist roots of it and all of that just really solidified it for me. And that's what actually helped propel my recovery. And now I specialize in working with people with disordered eating and eating disorders. And I'm especially passionate about binge eating disorder treatment. There's a lot more that I could say, but I'll stop there.
While you were going through this, was there anyone that knew that you had anorexia? Was there anyone looking out for you?
So people knew. I guess when I first developed the eating disorder, and the majority of it was binge eating disorder, I would say. The anorexia was the tail end, even though my guess is some of the long-lasting health struggles that I have, like osteopenia, are probably a result of those 14 months. Like, the physical damage on my body from those 14 months of, restriction were pretty bad. Yeah, people knew. In the beginning, I was desperate for help. I knew something was wrong. I knew that this was not okay. The binges were very disturbing to me. Again, in terms of my family, not to put, any blame there, but partially being an immigrant, just I think mental health is not understood. And so they were not able to help me or really understand that this was like an eating disorder. It was just kind of like, let's just stop overeating. In terms of other supports, I mean, whoever I would date knew, my boyfriends knew, my friends knew, and they tried to help. But as I mentioned, not all treatment is the same. And I think if weight stigma and fat phobia are not acknowledged, at least for me, that wouldn't have been enough. And I did encounter certain treatment modalities that were actually unhelpful or actively harmful, which is why I'm so kind of passionate about, health at every size as sort of the lens to approach eating disorder recovery. So in a roundabout way, people knew and people tried to help, but they were unable to. And I was unable to help myself in spite of my best efforts. And it was just on accident that I stumbled upon intuitive eating and health at every size and, as a philosophy of care. I think and I hope that these days, these approaches are better, more well known, but in the early 2000s, it was difficult.
It's interesting because these eating disorders commonly occur, 18, 19, or into the mid 20s. And I'm older now, and most of the women I know are middle aged. And I felt some of this disorder eating crop up a bit in my life at this transition point. I'm always just looking for answers. How do we help if we see someone struggling? If they're 18 or 19, or if they're 30 or 45, what can we do?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing I would say is just to kind of validate that life transitions are a vulnerable time. And yes, I think 18, 19 people do develop eating disorders at that age, but I think actually it's a lot more common these days, unfortunately, to see eating disorders showing up at younger and younger ages. Like, I think it's actually a lot more common to see eating disorders pop up in middle school or high school, as opposed to college. Like, that's kind of, I consider that a little bit late, actually. And that's because these are times of transition when bodies start changing and, the diet culture kind of mentality just clicks in. And so you do what you're told to do, which is, well, control your food, lose weight so that you don't experience negative consequences, negative social consequences, or just negative consequences. I think middle age, and I myself am sort of now also in middle age. I'm in my 40s, and it makes a lot of sense to me that any kind of time of transition would be a time of vulnerability. And middle age, bodies start changing, right? Just like with puberty. There's maybe fear of losing not just thin privilege, but maybe appearance, beauty privilege, or relevancy, so to speak, right? And again, for people who are socialized as female, we are told this is our value, this is our worth, this is our appearance. And also, change can just be scary, and you might want to kind of retain control where you can. We are taught that our bodies and our body size is something that is under our control. We start trying to control our bodies and our food. I think this might be a good point for me to mention that the issue is diets or restriction or management or weight management, however you want to call it, they don't work. Research tells us that dieting has a 95 to 98% failure rate within 2 to 5 years. And it gets harder and harder to sustain weight loss with every successive dieting attempt. And so the issue is that we are taught that we should be able to control something that is not actually meant to be controlled. Actually, bodies are supposed to be different. body diversity is a real thing, but we don't live in a world that celebrates that, or we don't live in a culture and a society that celebrates body diversity. And instead, there is discrimination and weight stigma. And so, all that kind of diet culture conditioning clicks in, and we try to diet and lose weight, and it doesn't work. And not only does it not work, but a third of people who, diet end up regaining even more weight than they lost when they started dieting. And then a third of people end up to developing disordered eating or eating disorders. So it's actually a dangerous thing.
It's very interesting because in the past, we've known there's anorexia and there's bulimia. And those are the two main eating disorders. But you had mentioned before, things just aren't as clear cut. How do we know if we have them if there is this shift going on into what is healthy and what is not healthy?
Sure, I'll answer that. And I just realized I didn't fully answer your previous question of what to do if you notice somebody is struggling. So I'll answer both. The question is, how do we recognize when something is serious enough, when someone is sick enough, so to speak? What would we look for?
Yes, you had mentioned that someone who's anorexic can be in a healthy weight body. What does it mean to purge once a month? Is that
Yeah. Yeah.
bulimia?
In terms of diagnostically in the DSM-5, which the DSM is a book written by people and it keeps being edited. And currently, we've got typical and atypical anorexia. And typical has a weight cutoff, and atypical is anorexia in people who are in larger bodies. I really dislike that categorization. I think a lot of people in the eating disorders field dislike that categorization because the only difference between typical and atypical anorexia is your weight. All the other behaviors are the same. The health implications are the same. And so what matters there is is there restriction and is quality of life impaired? Binge eating disorder is in the DSM-5. And it wasn't in previous editions of the DSM. And it's actually the most prominent, it's the most common eating disorder. Of course, there's bulimia, where there's overexercising in a compensatory manner. There could be laxative abuse. There could be throwing up, things like that. And then there's this whole other category called OSFED, other specified feeding and eating disorders, when some of the criteria are met, but not all of them. And then there's disordered eating, which is just, again, a lower degree. Maybe the binging is not as frequent. Maybe the compensatory sort of movement isn't as frequent or as intense, but it's still happening. When I meet with people, I think, and I've seen this, right? People really question themselves, like, is this bad enough? Do I deserve care? And my answer is yes. I believe that everyone deserves to have a peaceful relationship with food and with their bodies. And so if your relationship with food feels wonky, if you feel like there's something is off, I would trust yourself on that. And then you deserve care. It's not all that important to know, oh, it's this particular diagnosis. What matters more is what are the behaviors that are going on and what feels disrupted. Because it's not just food that's going to be disrupted. It's going to be your ability to show up and be present in your life in general, because there's usually a lot of mental preoccupation going on as well. If an individual suspects that there's something might be off with their relationship with food, that's enough of a reason to seek out support and to seek out a therapist who specializes in eating disorders or disordered eating. I think if someone comes to you and tells you that they're struggling and asks for help, I mean, again, that's enough. You don't need to know whether they meet criteria. Struggle is enough, you know? And of course, if you are noticing certain behaviors that feel off to you, like consistently skipping meals or things like that, you can gently open up that conversation. Like, hey, I'm noticing this is happening. How are you feeling? Right?
I mean, sometimes this hits you, later than your
Yes,
20s. And it might be
absolutely.
even more difficult to ask for help the
Yes.
older we get because of shame. Absolutely. What would be the first step of getting care
If it's accessible to you, I would say find a therapist and or a dietitian, a registered dietitian who specializes in eating disorders. And I think this is important, practices from a weight inclusive, health at every size approach. Normally, when I work with people with eating disorders, right, I try to have a team around them. And so, there's a dietitian, there's a medical doctor that I kind of try to consult with and have part of that team. I think just getting connected with a professional will be enough, and they will be able to guide you and advise you further. So just reaching out. I think another thing that might be helpful, and I know there's a lot of shame, is just maybe telling one trusted person in your life that you're struggling, someone that you feel the safest with, and maybe have them help you even move through that process of getting connected with support, because it can be a lot. It can be hard, right? Just even that process of reaching out to therapists can be hard. And also, I mean, you know, to your podcast, right? Like shame cannot live in secrecy, right? I think, yeah, I think telling someone so that you are less alone and to take away some of that shame.
How often does another mental health issue exist with an eating disorder? I would think there's major depression, bipolar, OCD. How common is that?
Yeah, I don't have the comorbidity rates in front of me, but I will say yes, very common. I mean, in general, it's rare to see someone just have one one issue, right? One mental health struggle, right? Because we, as human beings, we are complex. With eating disorders specifically, I do see a lot of OCD. I also specialize in OCD treatments, so I probably see more of that because of that specialty. There's some selection bias, but OCD is quite common. I see ADHD show up. I think major depression is also common. I mean, eating disorders in and of themselves can result in depression sometimes. So I think a good therapist will be able to kind of tease that apart and see what to focus on first. But yeah, definitely depression. And other anxiety disorders, just in general, I think are common. And of course, like mood disorders, bipolar disorder, substance abuse shows up. And again, there it's like you want to tease apart, you know, like what's primary, what's secondary. But yeah, comorbidities are, I would say, the rule rather than the exclusion, you know.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I know there's this framework called Healthy at Every Size,
Health at every size.
Public Health Framework, HAES.
Yes, health at every size.
Every size. Okay. So I find this interesting because it just seems like there needs to be a huge societal shift
Mm,
for this to change and for people to live healthily in any type of body. I think it's kind of a struggle. I don't know how we pull away from fat phobia, how we understand what thin privilege is. I guess I'm looking for ways, how do I change my mind? Because I do jump to conclusions. If someone is obese, I do think, okay, they need to get healthier, right? What really are we going to look at to understand health?
yeah, there's so much in that question. And this is sort of going to be the beginning of an answer, right? So, weight stigma, fat phobia, these are real things. And I think the first thing is to recognize that if we live in a culture, we all have certain things that we absorb that may not align with our authentic values, but, you know, we don't know any better, right? So, like, diet culture is like the water we swim in. And so I myself obviously had a lot of weight stigma throughout my entire disordered eating disorder, my entire 20s, which is what was kind of partially driving it. And so I think the first thing is to recognize that that makes sense. Because I think if we kind of just get overwhelmed with shame, like we're not going to be able to go forward. So it is not our fault that we live in this society where we are taught about this body hierarchy. And there's a lot of misinformation as well, right? So health and weight are very often conflated as if they're the same thing, as if being in a larger body is automatically bad and being a smaller body is automatically good and healthy. That's not true. I was in a smaller body my entire 20s, but I was not healthy. Similarly, I mean, you cannot look at somebody's body and know their health markers, right? Like even physical health. I mean, you don't know if they're struggling with major depression or cancer or what's going on or an eating disorder, you know? Similarly, there are people in larger bodies who are healthy and fit. The first thing to recognize is these are not like synonyms. And then in terms of health conditions and weight being a causal factor, that's not actually correct. So the truth is, there are some correlations between weight and certain health outcomes, but correlation is not causation. And there are certain things that don't get accounted for, such as weight cycling, which is the going up and down in weight, which happens when you have dieting attempts, because as I mentioned, dieting doesn't work. And so actually most people go up and down, they yo-yo. And that in and of itself, losing and gaining the same amount of weight is not healthy. Like that's going to contribute to negative health outcomes. And then also weight stigma, just like any stigma, negatively impacts health. And then disordered eating disorders, these things never get accounted for. So the picture is more complex, there's more nuance. And so what I sort of advise people to do is to focus on health. If health is a value, which it doesn't have to be, right? It doesn't have to be. And it's not a marker of morality, right? It's a personal choice. But if health is a value, you can focus on the health behaviors directly. You can focus on eating things that feel good or moving your body in ways that feel good, right? Like there's no need to bring weight into it. And then your weight is going to end up where it's going to end up. And, in terms of what is a healthy weight, I would say to me, right, and my definition of a healthy weight is not a number. It's wherever your body ends up when you have a peaceful relationship with food and when you are engaging in, behaviors that feel good to you, that are healthful for you personally. Which is kind of back to body diversity is real. I mean, go back through history. Like you could always see representations of people in different body sizes, right? We're not all meant to be the same size. We're not all meant to be the same. Like diversity is real and beautiful, right? In all the ways, right? Including body size.
So I would love a little bit of help with self-talk.
Sure.
Well, I do have a past with disordered eating. So I do get a lot of chatter in my head. And then I feel the shame and just like kind of downright embarrassment, like for being too old for this nonsense. Let's just move on. So if I do feel food is creeping into my mind too much, is there a place of self talk or mindfulness that I could at least start with?
The first thing I want to say is, well, thank you for sharing that. I think that's a brave thing to share, having shame about recognizing that body image or food insecurity is showing up. I think that's a little bit of like stigma about struggling. The truth is that we all struggle and we live in a culture that really reinforces food shame and body shame, and that there's a right way to be and to eat and all of that. It's not your fault that you are struggling. And, I think this goes back to like stigma around disordered eating and eating disorders. It's not about vanity. It's not about superficiality, right? It's These are actual real mental health struggles um, that are, as I mentioned, biopsychosocial. There are a lot of things reinforcing them, and we live in a culture that actually reinforces them. So I think that would be my first message. And with that, I think one thing that can bolster you is more education, like just about reading podcasts, right? There are so many different ways of learning about diet culture, about weight stigma, about disordered eating, about all these things to feel less alone and to have more of a context and to put less blame on yourself. This is also where self-compassion is so crucial. It was a big, big part of what helped me move through my recovery. I consider myself to be in a place of strong recovery, but I still live in diet culture and I'm still, in a body that is changing. And as I get older, right, it's not that um, insecurity, body image insecurity doesn't show up, or that like I don't have occasional thoughts about food, right? That like that happens. And I think it just makes sense because I live in this culture. And so how you meet that, how you respond to that is where you have control, not the fact that those thoughts pop up, right? We don't have control over what thoughts or feelings automatically show up, just how we meet them. So I think normalizing meeting yourself with compassion. I like to say, like, there's no shame in struggle. I think separating out that, oh, okay, of course these thoughts are coming up for me. I'm a human being living in a society, and, you know, this is the outcome of that. You know, how can I meet myself with kindness? What is actually the most beneficial thing for me, right? How can I kind of move through that and make choices that are aligned with my values, right? But yeah, I think self compassion is really, really important, which includes mindfulness, common humanity, and self kindness, right? The three components of self compassion. My encouragement would be, I think for a lot of listeners here, this might be the first time that they're encountering some of these ideas, and it might sound really radical and countercultural, like literally counter to the diet culture we all swim in. And my encouragement would be to try to stay open and um, to learn more. For me, after a decade of struggling, like I read that book and I was ready. I was on board. For some people, it takes more, right? My advice would be try to stay open and maybe start learning a little bit more podcasts or books. And if you're listening to this and some things are clicking in and really resonating of like, oh, I think maybe what I thought was just normal, like, food and body dissatisfaction, I'm now realizing it is getting in the way of me living the life I want to live, then that is enough of a reason to seek support and to seek help. You deserve a better quality of life. Yeah, you deserve more peace.
Thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
Please consider this podcast as a work of advocacy, getting important stories to those that need them. As we gather ideas how to keep the show running financially, please do engage with the podcast wherever you find it. Offer up some stars and some likes. You can visit us at bipolarshe.com or at bipolarshe pod on Instagram. And thank you, as always, for your support.